All right, we're live.
Cool.
That's easy.
Yeah.
By the way, Steve is skiing again today, so
Good for him.
Where does he live?
Portland.
Oh, nice. I'm jealous. I've gotten to go a couple days this year, but I'm really itching to get back out.
Yeah. So he texted me. He's like, I'm going skiing again today. And I was like, have fun.
I don't blame him.
So yeah. Good deal.
So,
Well,
so we've got a lot of stuff troubles in Israel, especially now. But the weather isn't one of them. If you check the temperature,
That's good. New York is pretty bad right now. It's dreary, overcast. It gets dark early. It's basically the worst time of the year to be in New York. But
yeah. Looks like Facebook is having trouble streaming, so we're just on YouTube and LinkedIn. Yeah, here we got a bunch of snow over the weekend, so it's nice in the sense that you look outside and everything's white and beautiful. And yeah, but the roads freeze at night.
oh yeah,
The ice
that's
is no
brutal.
fun to drive on.
I used to live in Vermont. I do not miss that.
Yeah. And AJ lives out here near me, so he's looking at the same weather. So
Cool.
And I
so
used
just
to
so
live
you
in
know,
Vermont.
this is like
Oh, you used to live in Vermont. Cool.
it's
Where, in
8
Burlington?
Shelburne, so
Oh, nice.
just outside. Yeah.
Cool.
So just so you know, it's almost 9 p.m. here in Israel, and it's 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
Not bad.
Shut up.
And I consider it cold, just so you know.
Oh, that's always funny. We'll have kids that come here for college or something from California, and it'll be like 65 degrees, and everybody else that grew up here is out there in t-shirt, and jeans, and they're like, "How do you do that? It's freezing here." We're just like,
Yeah.
"Just wait, just wait."
Yeah.
There's this thing
Anyway,
that comes after the fall.
so we were talking. The one thing that I'm always curious about with content creators, like you, is how do you decide which course to do next?
It's a good question. I mean, I make YouTube videos, and on any given video, there's 10 or 20 people asking for the next thing. So I started keeping a list of that, and we're launching a course on Radix this week, and that came from a couple months ago. Just we had finished a remix course and kind of took stock of what people were asking for, and there was a bunch of people asking for Radix stuff. So,
And do you only like? How do I ask this bluntly but politely? Like, I mean, you don't necessarily know all the stuff that you want to teach.
yeah. So we don't. Well, I wouldn't teach stuff that I don't have experience with. So basically, the free stuff we put out on YouTube and Twitter or talk about at conferences is stuff that I have experience with, and people usually have a lot of questions about that. So yeah.
So where do you get the experience? You do like
Well, we
consulting
do
work and stuff like
Yeah,
that?
we do
Oh, okay.
consulting, and we have side projects and things like that. But
So you might, so obviously if you've got a consulting gig, then obviously you get experience that way. But if you don't, then you might just go ahead and do some large side projects just to get experience at some interesting tech.
yep, side projects, and then a lot of our mentoring, or a lot of our consulting is in the form of mentoring. So we'll pair with teams to help kind of be a spare, more senior developer available to pair with folks working on stuff. So we see a lot of code and what people struggle with that way. And, we've also done trainings and things like that. So that we try to stay in touch with what, real world app developers are running into. And, we do some open source and demos and things like that too. So.
I'm kind of curious because I've been speaking with a bunch of people from various companies here in Israel working on, front end heavy offerings, as it were, and essentially all of them are using React on the front end, which is not surprising. The company I currently work at actually is a bit of you know it's, not
Anomaly.
anomaly exactly, but the interesting thing is that they're all React old school. Like, I mean, none of them are even thinking about Next.js, let alone React server components or anything like that. They're all
Hmm.
basically create React app,
Hmm.
which is like like huge client side React
Full
bundles
SPA
of
mode,
code.
basically.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Hmm.
exactly, because they're mostly just building web applications and dashboards and whatnot that are behind authentication anyway. So
Hmm.
and so these are not pages that get indexed or anything like that.
Hmm.
So they're just large scale React app running totally client side.
Hmm.
So it's
Yep.
interesting to see this kind of disconnect from where React is and seems to be going versus where I see most of the companies are at.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk about that because that came up in
Yep.
your last episode too.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. So maybe we should start.
yeah, let's do it.
Yep. All right, sounds good. I also have a question about format on this show, but I'll ask you guys that after, or maybe just throw it into our Discord channel. Anyway, here goes. Hey, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have AJ O'Neill,
Yo, 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 coming at you live from the fish tank.
Dan Shapir,
Hello from an Israel unbelievably still at war.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and this week we're talking to Sam Selikoff. Sam, do you want to introduce yourself? Let people know who you are and why we all love you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Sam. I am a front end developer. Fell in love with it, I don't know, 8 years ago, but started out kind of in PHP. Perl actually was my first language, but then I fell in love with JavaScript and was doing Ember development for a long time. And these days I'm doing React and a bunch of other stuff in the React ecosystem. And now I make courses on Build UI with my business partner, Ryan Toronto, and make YouTube videos. So, yeah,
Started in Perl and lived to tell about it.
there you go.
Yeah.
I have blessed a referent in order to get
Yeah.
an
I
object in Perl.
I
So,
jumped on just to see, and we had you on what back in 2019 to talk about Ember Octane.
yeah, there you go. So I was still
Oh, I
slinging
remember
Ember
that.
in 2019, but
Yeah.
I remember that. I'm not sure if AJ was there, but Charles, you and AJ, you guys are a big part of my early learning in JavaScript. Actually, I used to listen to JavaScript Jabber religiously, and I think AJ actually I learned about event delegation in JavaScript from AJ in one of the episodes, and I remember that one well. So yeah, it's always awesome to be here with you guys.
Yeah, good deal.
Yeah, we're all old guys.
I've got the gray hairs in my beard to prove it. So
I
that's
know when
Yeah,
I grow mine out, my wife's always like, eh.
yeah.
I think those of you who have hair should basically just shut up.
Yeah, I shave mine off because it's embarrassingly sparse. So,
It's a good
yeah.
look,
So
though.
let's compare notes. When did you write your first line of JavaScript?
I think it would have been like 2013.
23. How about you, AJ?
Um, I'm gonna go probably closer to 2008, 2009.
And you, Chuck?
So I have a question on this question, because I was playing with web development in high school, but I wasn't
Okay,
really
that count.
like
Yeah, but
seriously writing JavaScript,
no, but
right? So that
that
was
counts. That counts.
so it was probably 96, 97, but
Uh,
like
Okay.
getting into actual programming with actual, where I was writing against maybe a prototype JS or jQuery. That was probably 06, 05,
So
06.
so I wrote a large scale front, single page application, as it were, back in 97, 98.
That's badass.
Wow. Yeah.
Offline first, by the way.
Wow. There you go.
Very cool.
98. Should have been
Yeah.
impossible. Kind of
No,
was.
No fat arrow functions back then,
Nah. no,
eh?
no closures. No try and catch.
No closures?
No try and catch.
Wow.
If you wanted to catch an error, that you had window on error.
There you go.
Nice.
I
Nice.
do everything I can to avoid write and try and catch, but yeah, crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah.
All right.
The
Well,
good
should
old
we
days.
dive into our topic here? It sounds like there's
Yeah.
a bit of a backstory here because Sam, you reached out to us. There's been some back and forth on Twitter. Do you kind of want to set the scene for us, and then we can kind of fill in the gaps?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you guys had a podcast. It looks like it was November 14th. It was called RPC Resurgence from Client Server Applications to
That
Next.js
was
and
me.
Native Frameworks. And I think it was you three talking about it, actually. And you guys mentioned the slide from my talk that got turned kind of into a meme. But you were talking about server components and server actions and the new React features that kind of have been trickling out over the last year or so. And it was a really good conversation. And there was just some stuff in there that I thought would be fun to dive into a little bit more and just unpack. So that was kind of the backstory. And I guess that if we wanted to kick it off, Dan was talking about, had a really good kind of survey of like the history of RPC.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was when you were writing that SPA in '97.
Exactly.
But and then you also, I had a tweet about my slide and about server actions, and you had kind of replied saying like we used to do this and we chose not to, so it's there was a reason we chose not to. So maybe that is one way we could kick off the conversation. Basically, are server actions just RPC? Are they the same thing? And if so, then why should we not do them or do them? And if not, how are they different? So that's kind of what I think.
So it's a really interesting conversation for me because on the one hand, like you said, and it's funny, by the way, how we a minute ago spoke about the really old JavaScript and the early 2000s and late 90s, and now we've moved to the very latest form of JavaScript with server actions and React server components and whatnot. And again, we're going back in time talking about RPC. So in a lot of, as I was saying back in that episode, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some very significant differences. The similarity is that you're using the function call
Syntax.
syntax, exactly, for over the wire communication. So you're performing an operation that looks like a function call. You're sending parameters like you would into a regular function, and you're getting a return value like you would from a function, but it's actually being sent over the wire. And it's type safe and whatnot. Um, and that's exactly what RPC is, and that's what we're bringing back. But at the same time, there are some really notable differences because back in the day, if you looked at systems that did this sort of thing back in the 90s, and even more modern systems like gRPC, it's also about being able to communicate between different programming languages and different architectures. Whereas RPC that we're seeing in the context of React kind of lives and exists because everything is like this React app, and it's just trying to abstract away the concept of some stuff running on the client and some stuff running on the server. But it's not as a means of communicating between separate systems and even separate programming languages. It's more of the concept of doing everything within that same React app using TypeScript all the way, you know, up and down. So there are some like key differences here as well. So, I found that really interesting to see both the similarities and distinctions. But I think I might be pulling us forward maybe too quickly. maybe it's worthwhile to talk again a little bit about what there was in your slide and why
Hmm.
you think that maybe people got so hot and bothered about it.
Hmm. Yeah. So the slide was showing a server action where you clicked create a bookmark, and right in your components JSX, it basically had an on click, and then the event handler had the use server directive, which meant that that code ran on the server, and it used the SQL with a template tag literal to insert a new bookmark into the database. And folks, there was a couple things that kind of sparked it off. One was it looking like a SQL injection vector, which it wasn't, because template tags and the SQL function
Hmm.
sanitized that. But setting that aside, it was more about the separation of concerns, or the lack of separation of concerns, from the perspective of those folks. And that's kind of what got the conversation going. So um, it was kind of like showing, normally you have a button, and like you were saying, the form or the button can make a post request to an API endpoint over the network, and there's a separation there. It's like the front end calls the back end logic, and then the back end can be written in any programming language, and can be using Ruby on Rails or Laravel or Node server, and there's a nice separation here, and we are used to thinking about front end and back end development separately because they have different constraints, they're in different environments, they have different responsibilities. That's a good thing. And so putting all these things together maybe is not the best idea. So that's kind of the argument, and the criticism with the demo. So
And you also mentioned that you used to work on PHP, and I think it brought PHP back to a lot of people, and not just PHP, but also ASP, or
mm-hmm,
all these technologies that a lot of them intentionally or unintentionally mixed data access to the data layer alongside within the UI generation, because if you ignore for a minute the fact that maybe you're also doing some JavaScript on the client side, when you're doing PHP you're actually constructing the UI. It's
right.
all HTML templates, and people have had very bad vibes from the concept of mixing together within the same file the UI layer and also all the data access operations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one way to think about that is, if you go back to when React first came out, um, a similar kind of criticism that was probably the most popular one levied against it was that it broke this separation of concerns. And these folks had come from backgrounds where they worked on PHP apps with one big file and everything mixed together. It was hard to maintain those applications. And so separating it out made it easier to think about. The view was only responsible for the view. It passed the data through a controller layer, and then the controller was narrow and sent the messages to the model layer. And so the model layer was this clean business logic area, and the view was separate from that. And so that MVC architecture, or whatever variation of it that the server-side frameworks adopted, helped with maintainability. But when React came out, it made the argument that a lot of what we were doing with our front-end code, especially as we were writing more sophisticated front ends with richer client-side interactivity that needed access to data, and needed to have logic and error handling and all this stuff, is that putting these things in separate files based on the technology needed for each part of the UI to work. So you have a JavaScript file because you need the JavaScript behavior to respond to events. You need a CSS file for the styling, and then you have your backend stuff to handle the network requests. One of React's original arguments was that these things are all related, and they're all needed for a piece of UI to work. And the React component was a new abstraction that enabled this, because you could put a slice of the JavaScript, a slice of the CSS, a slice of the HTML markup that you needed in a single file, so that your dropdown, which required all three of those technologies for it to do everything it needed to do, would be co-located. And so separation of concerns is a design principle that helps you organize code because one part of the code doesn't concern or doesn't share concerns with another. But React's argument was that these all had the same concern. They were all there in order to enable a drop down to work, and therefore they are related. They should, and therefore the code should be co-located. And I think over time we've seen that has proven to be good. And in particular, the component as an abstraction has proved to help us organize this code that used to be in a single PHP file, let's say. Because we have the component and are able to break up our apps into components, the fact that they have multiple technologies inside of them, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, is not a problem anymore because we have the component and we can define boundaries based on actual concern. The dropdown doesn't have to be in the same file as the header, even though both of those files have all three technologies. So, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say a lot of people that I've talked to, when they talk about separation of concerns in some of these same ways, they try and bring up the single responsibility principle from Solid and effectively say, yeah, so we don't want to mix all this stuff together. But I've talked to Bob Martin actually quite a bit. And when he talks about the single responsibility principle, it's you want to put the code together that's likely to change together.
Exactly.
And
so
when
every
you're
time
talking
you
about
have to change your
JSX,
drop down and you're looking at, we have to open the JavaScript. Oh, the JavaScript is adding an event listener to document.query element by class. Boom. Okay, let's go to the class or the HTML to find the element that has the class. And then we need to update the style of that. So let's go open the CSS file and find where that class is declared. If you're opening three files,
so much sense.
Yeah, then those should be together. So that's a real simple way to think about it.
Yep.
So I agree with package structure. I mean, that's like the whole architecture of Go, is that things are organized by package, by component, if you will. The problem that I have is that, okay, yes, the three files change together, but they need to be edited by three different people. There needs to be the engineer that's editing the JavaScript, and then there needs to be the designer that's editing the pixel information, and then there needs to be that crossover front end person that's editing the CSS and the HTML. So that's where, and I think that trying to say, oh, a front end person whose primary concern is adapting design is also supposed to be a JavaScript engineer, to me that just seems ludicrous. Like, what are the odds that someone who is great at adapting design is going to really be a great programmer?
I think it's interesting because I think you just illustrated, what is it, Conway's law, where the structure of the code reflects the structure of the team.
And
And
I do think that AJ is the issue that AJ just highlighted is a real significant concern.
yes,
And I've seen teams stumble with it, like getting the design into the components and whatnot. Various solutions have come up along the way. First of all, if you're using some sort of a design system, it kind of partially solves that issue for you. There are only certain components where you really need to deal with the details of the pixel placement, and those are created once by, like, joint teams. There's also, to an extent, Tailwind exists to address and similar technologies exist to address such issues to an extent, and we're now even seeing AI being put to use in this context, of taking designs out of Figma and translating them into JSX that, developers could then embed within their components. But I totally agree that it's a problem, but I'm not sure that it's a problem that components, necessarily make worse than before. I mean, at the end of the day, you still had that issue of HTML and JavaScript and CSS needing to work together.
Yeah, I think I've definitely heard of teams working more along the ways that AJ mentioned. Some people, and there's different expertise, right? Someone who is an expert in CSS you can't be an expert in all three things, because there's people whose whole careers are just about HTML, the semantics of HTML elements and all the attributes, and a generalist isn't going to know as much as they do. But I think that those teams could still impose boundaries and maybe firewall off a developer from making changes to the design side because that suited them. But those boundaries should come from the organization and the coders and the designers, as opposed to being artificially imposed by the technology. So just because we can write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the same file doesn't mean we have to. But if we had to write them all in separate files, then we could never write them together. And, someone who's starting out could never just make that change all in a single file when it's, for a lot of the parts that are simple and they still change together. So I think the fact that the technologies were artificially imposing those constraints on everyone was not the best way to come up with those boundaries. But we still see teams having boundaries today between designs. For example, if you do have a design system, a component library, your developers who are experts on the JavaScript side and doing the actual UI programming pull in the pre-designed components from this design system. And those have a limited public interface that the design team controls so that the developers, stay along with the brand and everything. So I think those boundaries can be important and can still be created by the teams. But I think it's good that they're derived from the team's needs and, instead of imposed by the technology.
I'm gonna agree with you on this. I think, and people don't talk about agile development anymore, but this was one of the ideas that came out of some of the different agile methodologies was that, you get together every so often and have a retrospective where you talk about what's working for you and what's not. And at that point, you can say, look, we're going to keep using JSX because it solves these problems for us. And we're going to adjust our team structure or our team responsibilities or educate people who work with us or whatever to handle the other piece. Right. And so then, maybe you teach your designers, look, this is how components go together. And so if you need to adjust styles, you're going to have to look in one of these places. Right. But this is how we've structured the components that have an area of control. And so it should be relatively easy for you to figure out which component you're tweaking, and then you can go and edit JSX.
By the way, I wanted to say that for me, the component model that you talked about works best in React when it's coupled with the unidirectional data flow. When the data flows properly, then components really work. When it doesn't, it can become a hot mess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely aligned with the overall React philosophy. Especially when it came on the scene, they talked a lot about one-way data flow because the prevailing frameworks at the time used two-way bindings to try to get a lot of things done. So you just drop an input in, you bind it to a model. Ember was like this, Angular was like this.
By the way, do you remember that back when React came out, it actually had two-way data binding just to be on par with the other frameworks? It kind of had that mechanism built in, and then it kind of, fell by the wayside over the years.
I don't remember that actually. What was the syntax for that?
I'm trying to remember. I'll find it. I'll try to Google it while we talk about the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you could actually bind the field to a state.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
mm-hmm.
That was Angular's big selling point, and they were kind of the big dog before React. So I can see why they did that.
Yep. And that was it. It was nice that the framework was able to keep your UI in sync with your state, but as it got more complex and app got more complex, and there was two-way bindings happening in lots of places that were triggering effects or running other functions as a result of a change, it was hard to follow. So one-way data flow, I think, is a core principle of React. It's one of those like unwritten rules that you really need to understand and follow if you're going to be successful. And interestingly, one way to think about server components and server actions is that it's bringing that one-way data flow to the whole app across the network. That's actually how a lot of the core team has talked about it. So yeah.
And so going back to the slide that you showed, so we talked about like the two reasons that people were kind of, I wouldn't say upset. Well, maybe some of them were
Triggered.
upset, triggered. That's the best word. So one, like you said, was SQL injection, and we already spoke about why that wasn't really a concern, because it looks like an SQL string, but in actuality, it's actually a function call, so it can actually sanitize that string before it actually uses it, and that overcomes that issue because it's a templated string literal. Um, but I think the bigger issue was the mixing of concerns.
Yeah.
And I think, people say, okay, like you said, I'm encapsulating the relevant logic in the same component, like this.
Right.
But how do I now overcome the fact that I've got my SQL code spread all over the application? And if I ever need to change anything in the structure of, my data layer, that I basically need to go throughout my entire UI layer and fix it all up.
Yeah. So kind of along the same lines that we were talking about with the React component first bringing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the same file, you could kind of make the same argument there. Well, if every React component can define a new CSS rule and set a color, then we can just set a color. And that way, that means that our colors are going to be spread all around. And so if we need to change a blue somewhere and we're using this hex code, now we have to open up all of our React components and change it there. But of course, that's not what people do these days. They have abstraction layers and boundaries based on what changes. And so if every React component should use the same blue, then they reference it or import it from a module or in a design system or as a CSS variable, and the components reference that instead. So, libraries, frameworks, teams come up with different boundaries for their abstractions based on what things change. So that just because you can have the full power of all technologies in the file doesn't mean that's how people write applications. And so the SQL example in my talk was because I was just using the simplest version to explain the actual server action API. But in a real app, you would do something that resembles how you would do it today, even if you weren't using server actions. And if you had traditional API endpoints, if you looked at your API endpoint handlers, whether they're in Node or they're written in PHP or Ruby, those things also are not going to be calling directly to SQL, even though they can, right? They usually use a model layer. Like in Rails, you have active model. So your endpoints, your controller methods in a Rails app are accessing the SQL database via the model layer, via active record. And again, that's an abstraction point so that your controller can say, app.user.firstname, and first name can be a method on your model derived, or a full name. It can be derived from your first name and last name fields. The controllers aren't querying SQL directly and doing all of that work together. So these different abstraction points and boundaries and responsibilities, right? That's a real single responsibility principle being applied because you have an area for your business logic. And so the way that would look here is instead of just importing SQL and going directly to your database, you would import, a DB module or a model layer like a Prisma. You could import Prisma and call Prisma user create, or any other ORM you use or any business layer. Or you could even delegate to another service that's via HTTP. So basically, whatever you're doing.
I think Redwood.js uses Prisma that way.
Yep. Basically, however you're writing your API endpoints today that your SPA is already hitting, whatever logic's in there it's going to be the same exact logic that you can now put inside of the component with the server action. So again, it's not about making an argument about where your boundaries should or shouldn't be. It's about enabling the co-location of code that changes together in a way that we couldn't before.
So, and the way that I like to think about it is basically saying that, at the leaf node, let's say, of the component tree, you've got some client side interactive component, and it captures some event, and then it invokes a function that was probably passed to it as a prop. So it effectively now bubbles up that interaction. Now, in the past, at some point, you needed to explicitly send that across the wire into somewhere which wasn't React anymore. And now it bubbles all the way up to some component that actually does access the data, and somewhere along the lines of that bubbling, it crosses the network divide. You don't necessarily need to think about it as explicitly as you did before. It feels like it's functions all the way up. It's just that at one point or another, that function is an RPC function that effectively sent the data over the wire. But it looks and feels like a regular function.
Yeah, I think part of it is the ergonomics, which is what you guys talked a lot about in the last episode, because you can import a function and React can take care of serializing the arguments across the wire and deserializing them and giving you type information about that and errors, as opposed to what we have to do today, right? Which is just write fetch, put in a string to a URL, and then pass along the data in the request body. That's a very error-prone process in a lot of ways. If you were to give me a React SPA and ask me to show you all the ways that all of the user flows that SPA can make network requests, it would be hard. I'd have to search for fetch or whatever abstraction around fetch exists. I'd have to look at the URLs that are hit and the data that is collected, because data has to be serialized across the wire and everyone's kind of doing it their own way. Whereas a nice benefit from server actions is that, especially because if you're writing TypeScript, that they're traceable just like any other module is. So if we were looking at your SPA and you were using radix dropdown, from radix, a UI library, and I asked you to find all the places you're using that, we could just do that very easily because we can just look at the module import graph. And so now you can do that as well. It's kind of like what you're saying. The RPC calls have become first-class modules in effect, and they take part in the module graph. So that's a nice DX win. And it just takes a lot of the work off of our hands in terms of how we are going to go about serializing things. There's kind of a standard now with form data and action in React, and it just takes a lot of the work off. But I don't think that that's the most important part of this. I do not think it's about DX. And it's not about eliminating some of that boilerplate. It actually is about bringing those backend pieces of functionality to inside of the component boundary.
So I took it a step further and saying, yes, it's part of the component boundary, and it's also part of that unidirectional data flow. It's the data flowing from React server components down into client components as props, and it's events bubbling up from client components to server side operations where the data is actually persisted as function calls.
Right. Yep. And, I think something you said earlier is, there's a lot of folks who have React SPAs, and SPAs are nice because you can deploy them and they can make network calls to any service, and those services can be written in any code because it's server-side code. So a lot of companies have React apps that are talking to Python backends and Ruby backends and PHP backends. But now React is moving in a direction where they want us to write our backends in JavaScript so that we can take advantage of things like server components and server actions. And I actually don't think that's the right way to think about this. because you don't need to write your entire service layer in JavaScript to reap the benefits of the architecture. If you were deploying a front end, a React front end, it has a drop down that when you click on it, it makes an API request. It's true that that React app can run anywhere, and you can just deploy it. But if someone were to use that code, someone else on the team use that code, the backend would have to be there as well. So if you were to deploy that somewhere, the backend API call that the front end makes has to also be there, right? It has to be running. It's basically, you can think of it as a dependency. The front end has a dependency on the server-side endpoints. And what server components and server actions let you do is bundle the dependencies so that if I render a dropdown and it needs to run some server-side code, it's going to come along for the ride. It's a way to bundle the server-side logic and code that needs to run just by rendering the component. And I think that's the most important aspect of server components and server actions.
So what you're look, the reality is that what I'm seeing is that a lot of organizations out there have not necessarily embraced JavaScript or TypeScript as the backend language. So in order so what you're if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is you're saying, you can keep on using whatever programming language framework you like, but you will need some sort of be it Next.js or Redwood or something along these lines, as a kind of, the term I think these days is BFF, is like a back end for front end. We used to call this thing middleware, but basically a translation layer on the server side that is the endpoint for the RPC calls, and translates that into access to various microservices written in whatever. Am I like presenting what you said correctly?
That's one way you could use it, is to, if you did have a running node server, then you could have that kind of BFF model where your React components can interact with other server-side services at runtime because you're running it. You can also use them at build time, and we can talk about that. But I think runtime is the more interesting idea. And maybe one way to think about this is think about integrating something like Stripe checkout into your app. So let's just take Stripe, right? It lets you charge your customers money for your products. Let's say I have a PHP app. How do I integrate Stripe with my PHP app? That renders a React front end. Let's say I have a Create React app. Well, they're going to give me like a Stripe checkout React component that renders the front end. And then I need to import and use their SDKs in my PHP app, so that when my React front end, their component, their checkout component, can talk to my PHP server, which can then interact with Stripe's APIs, right? Because we put that kind of logic, webhooks, and all the logic that needs to go between our trusted server and Stripe's as a service, right? With all the secret keys there, that needs to run on our servers. So point being, if you were going to add Stripe checkout to your site, there's a client-side component and a server-side component. There's a client-side aspect and a server-side aspect to getting a full integration, a full stack integration with a service like Stripe. And the cool thing about server components and server actions is that you can imagine a world where that Stripe checkout component can include the server-side logic. And now you can just render it. It's going to do the same thing and talk to your trusted server, but the logic for integrating it, the surface area of that is much, much smaller. Maybe you just give it an environment key and it's on your trusted server, so that's safe. But now the back and forth communication, the error handling, it's not left up to you to do that, to make fetch calls or to wire up a new endpoint to do that. They can bundle it inside. And then, yes, if you have the capability to run node at request time, you could do certain levels of this. But even if you only could do it at build time, libraries could ship a lot more of the logic by including that server-side piece. So that's kind of one way I think about this, is that most libraries integrating with services is a great use case for this. And today, to integrate with a service, we have to have a front end piece and a back end piece. The front end piece is really easy to use because React now has all the primitives on the client to let us do things like just render a Stripe checkout. And that Stripe checkout component, that React component, is going to do all sorts of things in our browser, right? It can render drop downs that the user can use to choose their credit card. It can use any browser API it wants to set up the UI, but React has all the primitives needed for Stripe to be able to bundle those things inside of the component boundary, right? Because of use effect and use state, they can access the entire array of browser APIs and encapsulate that within the component. But we don't have a similar tool for the server. There's no way to encapsulate arbitrary server-side code inside of a component. But now with server actions and server components, there is. So companies, services, and even teams can start to bundle that in the same easy-to-use component interface. And
Bundle and also
that's one way to
compose it.
think about this, is like it's a missing primitive that enables more powerful components, in the same way use effect and use state were missing primitives that have enabled richer client components.
Bundle it and also compose it. One of the things
Exactly.
that I really liked in your talk, which I highly recommend people watch if they haven't for some reason, is how you highlighted the fact that with server components, before you even got into server actions, you highlighted the fact that with server components, you can actually uh, like because they're components, you can I'm, I'm
Interleave client and server components in the same
exactly.
tree.
Yeah, compose them together.
Yes,
That's the word I
exactly.
was looking for.
Yeah, and that's another really important point.
I just don't have enough faith in humanity. I just don't think people that are that smart. I just don't. You know, I don't think people are that smart.
But they
To
don't
be able
need.
to
But they
figure
don't
it
need.
out and
They
know
don't
where the
necessarily.
symbols.
But they don't necessarily need to be, because if you build the component interface correct, if Stripe did the work and built their component appropriately, and they should have the resources to do that, then effectively you're just dropping a Stripe component into your code, and you don't need to know anything about what's it doing on the back end, what's it doing on the front end, because it's self-contained.
That's the goal. That's the dream. We are in an early
So,
stage. Obviously, this is new technology. So right now, we don't
but it's
have
not new technology. It's PHP. Like, it's literally PHP. It's the exact same thing. We're gonna render this, and we're gonna render that, and we're gonna have some of the server code in there, and we're gonna have some of the client code in there. Like,
Yeah,
it
but
is
with PHP you
PHP.
were wearing, but that's like the whole thing of object oriented. Like with PHP you were wearing your underwear on the outside, in the sense that the all the interface that connected to the front end part, which was self-contained, to the back end through your own code, was all out there in the open. You know, all the endpoints, all the code that did the translation and stuff like that was not encapsulated. It was
So
fully
this is what
exposed.
this is what you can't do with PHP. You can't render something that fetches data, a list of countries. Let's say you're doing a drop down, you need to show all the countries, and the list of countries comes from your database. You render something that is a country list, and then inside of that, you render a drop down component from a UI library like Radix, and you pass the countries from the countries component into the drop down. And now you have a UI that is driven by dynamic data, but Radix is doing a drop down that renders a portal and has virtual scrolling and keyboard shortcuts. So the way those things compose together is the novel aspect of this. And the way I think about what it will enable in the future is the same way I think about how React enabled libraries, UI libraries like Radix, to exist today. Because when React first came out, if you needed to render a dialogue, you might have to render the dialogue right here, but then in the root of your app, you might have to do something like, oh, we need a separate div, right? We need a separate div outside of our tree. Because when we render the dialogue, it can't be inside of the content. It has to kind of portal out so that it lays on top of it. So there was 2 steps to rendering a dialogue. You could render it, but then when it was open, somehow you had to tell the root that it was open, and then you had to hook into this sibling div that was outside of our application so that the dialogue showed on top. Then React came out with portals. Portals solved that problem. And so today, if you install a dialogue component from a library like Radix or
No
React,
relation to the HTML portal spec.
well, where did that come from?
iframes.
Well, oh, is that a new spec that's coming, or?
Yes. So it's unfortunate that they called it portals, because there actually is a thing called portals that basically solves the single
It's
sign-on
not, yeah,
problem
but
without
it's not.
cookies.
Is it
The
still
cake
a
is a
thing
lie.
though? Is it still a thing? I think the whole portal thing was kind of deprecated somewhere along the way. I'm not sure that they're coming up
Maybe,
with it.
but with passkeys, it probably won't matter, because I think the primary use case of portals would have been single sign-on, and I think passkeys are going
Yeah,
to be the
but
final
I think we
solution to single
digress.
sign-on. Yes,
Anyways,
I'm just
just
saying
to-
that it's not no relation to the portal spec.
Okay,
we're
you were
talking about
saying it's not
HTML
related.
stuff.
Got
Yes, what I'm saying
Got
is
you.
that there's already a thing in HTML called a portal. We're not talking about portals.
Okay, got you. So there's a feature in React called portals, and basically every UI framework has something like this now that does let you render a div elsewhere in the tree. If you need to render it outside the tree of where you currently are, right? If you're toggling something and you show and hide a paragraph and it moves the page, that's like what you want, that's fine. But for things like drop downs and dialogues, you want those to be able to render outside the current tree so that that UI element is on top conceptually in the Z index, and it doesn't interfere with that. It sits on top of the existing content, right? And so there used to be a step to do that. So if I was an author of React modal library, I would say to use my modal library, first render capital M modal and put your content in there, but then also come here and render, modal root alongside your body tag, so that when the modal renders, it behaves like a well-behaved modal. It renders on top, and it doesn't. None of the other contents of your page obscures it. But then React added portals as a feature to the library. It was a missing primitive, which let you move that logic inside the component boundary. And so today, if you install something like Radix or React Aria or Headless UI, you get to render a modal wherever you want. And behind the scenes, within that component boundary, it's going to set up a portal. It's going to set up context. It's going to set up effects that add keyboard listeners. All of the features of those UI components are contained in the modal in the component boundary. And using those components is the easiest part of working with React today, because you get to just render them. They're declarative. They take props, and you can conditionally render them in JSX. It's like the most base. It's just like rendering HTML elements, right? Because that's what it's based off of. But they contain all this functionality, all the browser APIs that they need inside of that component interface. That makes them easy to use. So exactly like Dan was saying, you can imagine a world where a CMS like Contentful gives you a text field component, and the text field, you can say, what's a prop? The model name is user, and the ID is 123. It's coming from the URL, and that's it. You just drop that into your app, and now it's going to be able to read the data from Contentful on the server side. It'll populate it as you type and make changes. You could hit save, and hitting save is going to run a server action that's bundled inside of the component by Contentful and makes a write back to your CMS. And you didn't have to do that 1-2-step integration where to use Contentful, text field, first, import the React component, add it to your front end. And second, create a new API endpoint and integrate with our SDK on your server, because all of it can be bundled in the component boundary. And it respects the data flow from your React tree. It can trigger re-renders. It can pass a draft version of the content to other React components. That's the composition story that we never had in PHP. And that's the goal of what these new primitives enable?
So I've got two concerns. I'll start with the first one. The first one is and I mentioned these concerns, by the way, in that episode when we spoke about RPC. My first concern is the proliferation of endpoints or APIs. Like in the old days, because creating APIs was so explicit, we were very intentional about creating those API endpoints. And, we tried to minimize their number simply because they were not that easy to create.
Mm-hmm.
And we if we were doing things right, we use, let's say, RESTful APIs or maybe GraphQL, but let's stick with RESTful APIs, and we modeled them according to the structure of our data, and we use them that way. These days, an API is as easy as creating a function. So it's likely that we're going to have a ton of internal APIs within our application, and they're going to be wholly distinct from the external APIs that we create. So maybe nobody is actually checking that the external APIs still properly work because we're not using them anymore. And that kind of scares me, this cavalier approach to endpoint creation.
Yeah, I think I would kind of take the same thinking as when we were talking about how React originally brought HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into the same file, just because that enabled you to write anything you wanted in a single file doesn't mean that that's what people end up doing, and they end up creating abstractions and boundaries um, for things like design tokens for CSS, so that we're not just writing CSS rules from scratch in every component. I think it's React's job to enable that low-level co-location, and it's a framework's job to impose healthy conventions and constraints in the same way that Ruby is a programming language and you should be able to do anything you want with it, but you can't do anything you want in Ruby on Rails. Or if you try, you're going to have a really bad time. So Ruby on Rails has guidelines and conventions that you follow that keep you on the happy path, that keep your app easy to maintain. Skinny controllers, fat models is a popular one, right? It's kind of a best practice in Rails apps to keep your controllers skinny. So if you have controller methods and they have a ton of logic, they check your user logged in and if there's permissions, and then they check if there's database entries, and you open up your controller method and it has all this logic that maybe really belongs in the model layer, and you're missing like a new abstraction there. And Rails and DHH has done a really good job creating these conventions and guidelines to help people build maintainable applications. I think of React as a programming language for UIs. And I think of server actions and server components in the same way I think of client features like use effect and portals and context. They're primitives that enable kind of higher level abstractions, but they were missing pieces in the programming language. And now frameworks like Next and Remix can impose conventions and constraints for what developers need to do most of the time. And that's going to look like, maybe that looks like not going willy-nilly and having, low-level server actions anywhere, but instead you have something like what Remix has, which is let's give each route a loader and an action. So now if you want to know which pages in your application talk to the network, you just know. You look in the routes file and you just see a loader or an action. And you also know as a developer, every time I define a loader or an action, I need to secure it because that's an endpoint that's exposed to the public internet. And that's what Remix developers know. And there's also, linters and guidelines in Remix that help you remember that. So I think the kinds of framework level, app level concerns you're talking about, things like security and maintainability, I think those are the jobs for the frameworks. And I think people who are building an app with React should be using a framework for the same reason I think people who are building an app with Ruby should be using a framework like Rails and not starting from scratch with Ruby.
I agree with everything you said. I do think that I'm not sure frameworks can take us all the way. I think that best practices will need to evolve beyond what frameworks can and should enforce. Like maybe pulling the, like we said, I talked about the fact that, the events bubble up. And now with server actions, they cross the wire somewhere along the way. Maybe you want to pull that point higher up within the component tree, like to the highest node that still has the appropriate context, so that you kind of minimize the number of these kind of crossing points that you have. But I
That's
guess
basically what Remix does. Remix hoists the actions and loaders to the route level. So if you want to know how your React app is interacting with the network, you only have to look at the route file. You don't have to worry about leaf components deep down.
yeah,
Um,
I totally get it. I actually think that React server components are intentionally not that. And the
yeah, they're not.
Stripe example that you gave before is a perfect example, because you can have the Stripe component dropped in within the page, and
Hmm.
the router doesn't need to know anything about it.
Hmm. Yep, that's true. So it is true that if you are in a world of server components and server actions, part of the whole point is that any component can interact with the network. That's part of the benefit, is that they're encapsulated inside of a component. And so yes, you could drop a Stripe checkout deep in the tree, and now it's making a network request that you didn't maybe like you didn't opt into intentionally, I guess. But I still think there's a way for frameworks to kind of solve this problem. I see the possibility to create that Stripe component as something that React is trying to solve. And and now we have the primitives for that to exist. And then the question of how best do we use these new powerful full stack components in a way that doesn't expose our apps to new security risks or keeps our apps maintainable. That's going to be something that we figure out and that we get advice from with frameworks and different opinions. So,
All I'm saying really is that it does make a lot of sense to tie the communication to the router in many cases, because at the
mhm,
end of the day, in a lot of cases, it is the navigation that's all about changing your state.
mhm.
But as that Stripe example shows, that's not always the case.
It's
So
not
it's a
always the case,
so it's a
but there,
very powerful model, but it shouldn't be the exclusive model.
yeah,
Basically.
and it's also not the exclusive one because um, another primitive that has recently come to React is suspense, and suspense is all about coordinating things like data requests. So you can drop in your Stripe checkout component, and let's say it has to load data first before actually charging someone. Like just to render, it requires data. It requires the current user. It requires your catalog of products and the prices. So you just drop that in and you say, well, isn't that bad because my route already loads this other data. Now I'm dropping in a Stripe component deep down in my tree and it's going to do its own data fetching. How does that all work? This is where suspense comes in. Suspense lets the whole tree of components tell the parent, hey, I'm not ready yet. And so I have this network request or this one. You can hoist them. But basically, suspense lets you keep those at a choke point, but still have the logic inside the component boundary so that you do get to do things like if a framework was to decide we only want to load data on URL change, they can do that without breaking the encapsulation of the fact that the Stripe checkout component knows what it needs from Stripe. I just know that it needs to load data, but I don't know how it gets that. They can do
Yeah,
that for
and you
me.
don't want and you don't want to be blocked on it. Is the most important aspect, I think, at the end of the day,
Well,
really.
sometimes you might. Sometimes you might want to block on getting every data loading component to fetch its data before it renders. Sometimes it might be below the fold and you want to let it render lazily with the loading spinner. And again, suspense is the answer. That's the primitive that lets you have control over that. But you still get the benefit of having the component have its own logic inside of the component boundary.
So one point that I did want to mention is like another as a final point on my end that's kind of related to RPC, which we've also brought up in that discussion. It wasn't a problem when RPC existed back in those days in the 90s, and it's also a problem with quote unquote RPC here within server actions, as far as I can tell, and that's versioning. That you're tying the version of your client to your server. Now, you might think, hey, that's not a problem. I mean, it's everything part of that single Next.js app, which I deploy as a whole. But you're not thinking about the situation where somebody keeps a client up and running while you're, let's say, updating the server version. So you can get, even if it's like all a part of that single app, you can get into version mismatches between the client and server fairly easily with long living client side web apps.
Yes, that's a problem that's existed, since we started doing long-lived client development, right? If you have a route split create React app and you only load the first page, the person leaves it open for a day or two, and then they navigate, maybe they get a different version of the next chunk, or that chunk references a different version of something because there's been a deploy since then and they haven't refreshed. So I think that this comes up a lot with long-lived clients, but I think either React or Next has some built-in stuff. I think React has some built-in stuff to kind of fingerprint the version of the server action that a particular client component may have gotten reference to. I'd have to look more into that, but
Yeah, but
it's
then
definitely
what do
something
you
they've
do?
written about.
But
Is
then what do
that
you
like
do?
API versioning on your Rails app or PHP app, right?
Exactly, it's like that.
Yeah,
What do
tell
you
it
do?
you're using V1 in your path instead of V2 in your path.
Yeah,
Right.
but like when you're doing RESTful APIs, you're cognizant of that. You're very explicit
That's
about
fair.
it.
Yeah.
And you can make sure to maintain backward compatibility, at least one version back. It's pretty
Mhm.
straightforward. When you're doing everything with RPC and it's intentionally made to look like a function call,
Right.
You've added a parameter in the next version and it's suddenly incompatible.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I do know that I'd have to look. I don't know off the top of my head. I know that they have some solution to this, and I think they've thought about it, but I don't know off the top of my head what it is. But I think I'd have to look more into it. But that's definitely
And
something.
The good news here though is that between the cookie banner and the subscribe banner and the did you want more content banner, the people are probably never going to get to your site, so they'll probably never notice.
There you go.
Oh man.
All right. Well, if we're
So
going here,
it's just one more thing. It's just
There you
it's
go.
just one more thing in the list of things that are going to go wrong on your site.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to push us
Business
to
as
picks. Sam, if people want to follow you or check out Build UI, what are all the links, URLs, etc.?
Yeah, buildui.com is our site with our courses. We've got a Tailwind course, we've got a React Server Components course, and a Remix course. We really love building with Remix, and Framer Motion, which is a cool animation library. And this week we're putting out one on Radix, which is a UI component library. So
Nice.
if you're into that, you can check that out. We have a newsletter, buildui.com/newsletter. It's a nice way to keep up with what we're doing. And then I'm on Twitter, so Sam Selikoff on Twitter.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do our picks then. We'll put all those links in the show notes. And if you drop them in the little chat over here, we'll make sure they also wind up in the comments.
Awesome.
AJ, what are your picks?
Okay. Let's see. So I had some last week that I didn't. First and foremost, I'm going to pick this no backend. There was a movement called no backend that started, I don't know, 100 years ago, something like that, 2017 maybe. And I don't think that it has any chance of succeeding. but it's kind of the idea of if you just created standards for common actions, then you could have components for the backend. That, I mean, essentially kind of what we're saying, but
Mhm.
it would be API. It would just be a well standardized API, so that on your front end you didn't have to be aware of the backend. So same kind of effect. You'd be able to install a component for front end and back end, for lots of different things. And the person who put this site together, it has examples of like user accounts, generic data storage, emails, permission sharing, file conversion, payments, etc. Well, the only other one on there was make coffee or tea, but that's kind of a joke because of the HTTP 419. I am not a teapot. But anyway, so that that idea I really like. The reason that I say it'll never take hold is in comparison to this like RSC type thing, is that our entire foundation of the internet is built on money that doesn't exist. It's low interest rate loans from the Federal Reserve that get pumped into investor money, that get pumped into businesses that don't ever need to have a thought about being profitable, that the only thing that they need to do is to grow. And as long as we have that, the proprietary nature of creating a payments API that only works with one provider is going to always trump over having a payments API that any provider could use, because you're not trying to get profitability and then compete in a free market. You're trying to take advantage of government regulation and investor, hot potato, to just create businesses that have growth, and you want to trap in this one little niche thing like what Stripe has done. It's funny, people, I mean, Stripe in particular, like, they have way better documentation and way prettier pictures on their website. Other
עוד
than that,
5 דקות.
huh? Oh, other than that, they kind of look like the other 15 different options that you can choose from. It's like you put in a credit card, you pass it, like it's not. Anyway, so but I like this idea. This would be my dream, is that we use protocols rather than companies, and that it's a free and open market where the company that can provide the best is the one that wins, rather than the one that is able to uh, use investor money to create advertising hype, to create a proprietary API for something that should be relatively simple and open, like messaging or file storage or whatever. But old man yelling at clouds aside, there were a couple of things that I had to pick. One was Home Assistant, which I just mentioned last time because we were really running low on time. But Home Assistant is, it's also bittersweet. That it works at all is what's really cool about it. It is definitely not end user friendly whatsoever. But if you are, an IT guy or a programmer, you can probably get it set up and get it working. And it doesn't really matter whether you buy the box where it's pre-installed or not. It's basically like Apple HomeKit or Google Assistant or Alexa Home. It's that type of software, and in fact, it integrates with those things as well, so it can piggyback on those. If you happen to buy a device that doesn't have a way to have a local API or Zigbee or Z-Wave or any of the standards that have existed for home assistants and smart home stuff before the Google Assistant type of things kicked off. But anyway, I was able to get it working. I got it. It took me a few hours to get my thermostat set up on a schedule, which is not, I mean, I guess it would take that long if I just bought a thermostat at Lowe's and then pressed the buttons on it going through the schedule menu thing. But anyway, it works. Like, you can have cameras. I've got a camera connected to it that's using OnVIF, which is the open video standard for security cameras. I've got a thermostat via Z-Wave. I'm going to get a power device via Zigbee, and I think that that's probably going to be as easy to detect as Z-Wave. But it's all event-based, and the problem is that it's like there's no modules for, here's your thermostat module. Everything is if this, then that style. So your thermostat has an event like temperature change that it fires off, and something can listen for that. And you can have a schedule system like a calendar, for example, and say, okay, like 9 a.m. is an event. And what should the event do? Well, the event should trigger the thermostat to be set to 72 degrees or, and that sort of thing. So wiring it up is very tedious, but at the end of the day, it works at all, which is better than the alternative of not having any way to do any sort of smart automation in your home without having Google and Amazon listening to every conversation that you have and knowing when your lights are on and what your power bill is likely to be and all that stuff that, can just kind of feel creepy. So I'll pick Home Assistant. There's a couple of different sites. One is Ameridroid. Another is Cloud Free. And those are sites that particularly sell things that are known to be compatible with Home Assistant and probably some of the other ones like Habitat and whatnot. And then a lot of the stuff you can get on Amazon, but it's very difficult to do any sort of search on Amazon and actually know whether or not the thing is actually going to be compatible. Whereas if you use Ameridroid or Cloud Free, I mean, it's, they're selling all of these DIY smart devices, that they're already pre-flashed with the right firmware, or they're already kind of set up so that you can start using them in your home with the different sensors and relays and whatnot. One of the things I'm going to do is get my garage door opener so that I can open it and I don't have to worry about, some data leak happening and then, anybody that gets the Amazon database being able to open my garage door or something like that. So, kind of a love-hate relationship at this point. Love that it is allowing me to do things I couldn't otherwise do. Hate that it is extremely geared towards people that want to edit YAML files and do if this then that and not just have a module for the thermostat or the garage door or whatever, like
so do you have a Docker container for your thermostat?
So it does that. It does that automatically. That's how it works. So you install Home Assistant boots up the Docker container. So there probably is a Docker container for the Z-Wave module. I don't know exactly how it does it. I just put it in a virtual machine and then pass through the USB device to the virtual machine and let it do its thing, and it's working. And I have it segmented, so I have a separate network in my home that's an IoT network where any of the home devices, like our laptops and phones, can access the IoT network, but the IoT network can't go back and access anything else. So it's like, even if I buy some weird device that has hacked firmware on it, I'm relatively safe. Now, obviously, that's not something the average person's going to do. And even as a programmer, you're not going to have any idea how to do that.
AJ, better you than me is all I've got to say about that.
But the thing is, one day it'd be nice if we did have a box that could just do the stuff that's just plug and play. And some people have got to deal with this iteration of technology in order for us to get to that iteration of technology. And then one other thing that I will pick today is Chaos Walking. Did I mention that I watched the movie? I don't know if I mentioned I watched the movie. So the books are good.
You did.
Okay. Yeah, the books are good, and the movie was...
You despaired on the quality of the movie.
It's a completely different story that happens to have a few of the same characters. So for anybody that watched Jurassic Park 2 and read Jurassic Park 2, it's the same kind of thing, like completely different story. A couple of the same characters have the same names and a couple of the same catchphrases. But other than the first 30 seconds of the movie, which is exactly the same as the book, a boy walking through the woods, talking to himself, from that point forward, it's just a completely different story that has a few of similar motifs in it. Like Jurassic Park 2 was a completely different story, but it was also a story about dinosaurs. So that's what I have to say about it. So yes, if you did not like the movie of Chaos Walking, I highly encourage you, but you like the premise. Like the trailer was interesting, the movie was terrible. Take a look at the books because the books have a coherent story, and it's really good and compelling, and it is nothing like the movie other than there is a Mayor Prentice and there is a Viola and there is a Todd Hewitt, and they have noise. So those will be my picks for the day.
All right, Dan, what are your picks?
Okay, so my first pick is going to be a series that I'm currently watching on Netflix, which is amazing, and it's called Blue Eye Samurai. And if you've not watched it, you need to watch it. Now, it's an adult show, so there's some nudity and some sex and lots of violence, but the artwork is amazing. The storytelling is excellent. I'm really enjoying it. So I highly recommend it. And it reminded me of another excellent story show about samurais, which is which is really different, but in some ways surprisingly similar, which is that old show Samurai Jack from like originally like 20 something years ago, and then with a few more episodes 12 years after that, which is also highly recommended if you can find it. But like I said, it's like a totally different character of show. It's mostly intended for like it's effectively a show for kids, but it's one of those shows for kids that adults enjoy more. Uh, but uh,
Mm,
but Blue Eye Samurai is definitely a show for adults, not for kids. So
cool.
um, yeah, I highly recommend it. So those would be my picks for today.
All right. My picks are going to be a little bit heavy. So, Sam, why don't you go ahead and go first?
I was going to say Lessons in Chemistry. A bunch of people were recommending it to me. It's an Apple TV Plus show, and it's really great. It's like a timepiece in the 50s, I guess, and it's about chemistry and cooking, and it's just really well made. So I've been enjoying that.
Cool.
We started
Um,
watching it, and then we let our Apple TV subscription, end. And we didn't renew because
Mm-hmm.
I just, I can't abide by the fact that you pay for a subscription, but then you also need to pay for the movies that you want to watch. So it's kind of annoying.
Mm-hmm.
well, the other thing is I think we quit paying our cable bill way back when it was like $100, but I think we're already halfway to there with all of our streaming services. And so, yeah, unless there's something really compelling to keep you there, just pick the ones that have most of the stuff you want. Anyway, so I'm going to get a little bit heavy. I'm going to get a little bit personal as well. And I feel like I just want to talk about this for a minute, mostly so that if there's somebody in your life that you can help out, that you can do it. And if my talking about self-harm or suicide will bother you, then turn off the episode at this point. So right before Christmas, my brother, he's 32, attempted to end his life. And he bought himself a pistol, and he wound up he put the gun to his temple, but when he pulled the trigger, his hand moved forward and he shot his eyes instead of his brain. And so, we still have him here, is essentially what I'm saying. We kind of got lucky in that sense, but he's blind now. And so a lot of the things that I've been talking about releasing, I haven't released because I've been dealing with family stuff for the last month. That all said, what I really want to put forward is so I'm involved in several other things, right? And so I've had to explain to some people in other areas, hey, look, this is what's going on. And so this is why I've been in the place that I have been, and why I haven't done everything that I wanted to do for you. And, everybody's been very understanding. But the thing that really surprised me was that a lot of people basically said my son or my brother or my parent or my family member, my friend attempted suicide. And so it's I'm finding that it's something that touches a lot more people than I thought. And you kind of hear the statistics, but it never really hit home to me as much that a lot of the people that I talk to have had experience with a friend or family member who has tried to end their life. And so, a couple of things that I just want to put forward is, first of all, my brother and I mean, we didn't have a bad relationship. We just didn't really ever talk all that often. And he was kind of a loner, and so that kind of happened. But for one, if you haven't talked to somebody in a while, if you have a relationship with somebody where you feel like or wish that it could be better. I mean, even if there's history there, right? Because sometimes that's the way it is. Just take a minute and reach out and let them know. And then the other thing is that what I'm finding, I actually went and talked to a therapist last week. After I'd kind of got, I set it up when I was really suffering, and then I had kind of gotten through most of my anger and frustration and things like that, which is why I haven't talked about it to this point, because it's just been really hard for me to think through and deal with. But I'm feeling a lot better now about things, and just working toward how I can help him out. But a lot of people have that hole in their life, right? And I'm not going to tell you how you feel it. I also haven't been that low in my life where I felt like I wanted to hurt myself. I also have a number of friends who have addiction issues, and they tend to fill that same kind of hole with some kind of an addiction, whether it's drugs or pornography or something else. But just realize that a lot of people out there really are suffering, and they're going through a lot of things, and you need to figure out, if you're feeling that hole, how to fill it. And for me, I fill it with my family and my faith and things like that. Um, and if you can't figure out how to fill it, then go talk to somebody, go talk to a professional. The other thing is that if you have a friend or family member that goes through something like this, just realize it affects you too. And that if you need help, you should also go talk to a professional, or go find a church leader or somebody that you can confide in and find that help. Because I can tell you, I have a couple of really close friends. We get together every Wednesday night and play board games. And we played board games basically the week after, and just talked, and it helped so much, right? And they're not professionals, and they weren't telling me, oh, you should really do whatever, right? um but yeah, if you're experiencing this kind of anger or frustration because somebody did something, whether it was personally directed at you, or you're just angry that they did something like what my brother did, um go find somebody to talk to and go find that help. um
Yeah,
I
humans
think
are social creatures. We need that human interaction. But I totally agree with what you said, that find somebody to talk to.
mhm.
But if you really need professional help, then go for it. Don't
Yep.
don't assume that just talking to a friend is a sufficient substitute.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm giving any specific or concrete way of knowing where you're at with some of this stuff. And a lot of times it's really hard to figure out. And, one day it's great, and the next day it's not. But just be aware, and, look out for other people, the people you care about in your life, and look out for yourself. I think that's all I really have to say about this, but it's just kind of been, it's something that I've really wanted to just tell people to just think about. So, all right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Sorry to get all deep and
No, thanks for
emotional.
sharing, man. I'm sorry you're going through that.
Yeah,
That's rough,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
appreciate you sharing, man. That's You're thinking about your family for sure.
yeah, thanks. All right, well, we'll wrap it up here. Till next time, folks. Max out.
By the way, before we drop off, Sam, first of all, it was a great pleasure to speak with you. I don't think we've interacted before. I
Yeah,
would
I don't
really,
think so.
I would really love to keep